Night fell upon the Red Keep, draping King's Landing in a hush that trembled with the weight of unresolved conflicts. Myrcella Baratheon, queen by circumstance, daughter of two families locked in perpetual strife, sat by an arched window in her private solar, staring at the city. Lights flickered throughout the winding streets, hints of a life that went on despite war and famine, despite betrayal and sorrow. Every lamp burning in the distance reminded her of another soul she was charged to protect, another life set upon a precarious edge. She could hear the faint murmur of voices in the hall. Knights of the gold cloaks changed shifts, chainmail jingling as they passed one another. Outside her door, a pair of sworn guards stood vigil, watching for any sign of treachery. Betrayal in the Red Keep had become so common that these men never truly relaxed, even in the darkest hours. Earlier that evening, Myrcella had held a small meeting with her most trusted advisors, Lord Mathis Rowan, Ser Courtenay Penrose, the newly arrived Maester Gorman with Samwell Tarly in his shadow, and Jon Snow, her consort. None had spoken loud enough for the guards outside to overhear, but the air in that chamber had felt thick with tension. The realm, her realm, though she still felt it a borrowed garment, seemed to be unraveling anew. Tywin Lannister's quiet maneuvers at Harrenhal, the Iron Bank's rumored interest in financing a second wave of conflict, the possibility that the Iron Islands might join Tywin's cause for gold or plunder, Stannis Baratheon's uncertain stance, and the final acceptance of Robb Stark's independence in the north were but a few of the knots twisting around her throne. She pressed her forehead to the window's chilly glass, wishing for the 100th time that she could slip away from all of it. But that was a childish fantasy, one she could ill afford. If she abandoned King's Landing, who would stand up for those who had suffered under Joffrey? Who would protect them from Tywin's wrath? She might be ill-prepared to bear the burden, but the burden had found her. She had to carry it. The door opened behind her with a slight creak. Myrcella did not turn around, yet she knew who it was even before he spoke. She knew the sound of his tread, the careful, deliberate step that had once belonged to a bastard of Winterfell but now belonged to a man bridging two worlds. "Myrcella," Jon Snow said softly. "May I come in?" She nodded, turning to face him. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the orange glow of the torches in the corridor. He had left his cloak behind, wearing only a dark doublet and breeches, dressed more for comfort than ceremony. He shut the door quietly, nodding to her guards, then approached. "It's late," Myrcella said, managing a small, weary smile. "I didn't expect to see you again tonight." Jon's expression was gentle. "I couldn't sleep. There's too much on my mind. I thought you might be awake as well." She gestured for him to sit. He chose a padded chair near the fireplace, and she sank onto the cushioned bench by the window. Outside, the sky over Blackwater Bay was moonless, the waters black as ink. For a time, neither spoke. Myrcella fiddled with the embroidered hem of her sleeve, lost in her own thoughts, while Jon stared at the banked coals in the fireplace. At length, he cleared his throat. "I was thinking about the Watch," he admitted. "Sam has told me how dire things are. More wildlings rallying, rumors of White Walkers. The Watch doesn't have the men or the supplies to hold them off if they try to cross the wall in force." Myrcella nodded. "I know. And yet, Tywin threatens from the west, and the lords of the realm quibble over coin and claims. It feels like I'm trying to bail water from a sinking ship even while I see another storm on the horizon." Jon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I've been asking myself whether I should go north. The vows I once took still feel like part of me. I never truly imagined leaving the Watch behind. And with winter approaching, the realm will need someone who understands the threat beyond the wall." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. There was a pang in that gaze. "You would leave King's Landing?" she asked quietly. "Now?" He shook his head, hair brushing his brow. No, not if it would leave you vulnerable. We both know Tywin might strike at any moment. My place is here, I think, for as long as you need me." She looked momentarily relieved, though guilt quickly chased that relief from her features. "That's selfish of me, isn't it? To need you here for politics while the wall stands in danger." She lowered her head. "But if Tywin storms the city, or if chaos erupts, I'm not sure I can hold it without you. The lords look to you, and the small folk respect you, too. They think you might be the next Ned Stark, only kinder, more tempered by the years on the wall. A ghost of a laugh escaped Jon, humorless. I don't know how Ned Stark I am, but I'll do what I can. She reached out and took his hand. Her grip was warm despite the night's chill. You've given me courage, she whispered. I never thought I would be a queen forced to fight a war of letters and steel. But here we are. Jon squeezed her fingers gently. Here we are. In that fragile moment, it occurred to Myrcella how odd it was that they had married for the sake of the realm, that so many expected them to be strangers merely sharing a crown. Yet there were times like this when she felt closer to Jon than to anyone else in the world. They were both children of complicated legacies, both caught in a swirl of destiny neither had asked for. They had found a small measure of solace in their shared burden. Eventually, they lapsed into lighter talk. The next day's audience, the possibility of forging alliances with certain Crownlands lords who had stood aloof, the distribution of grain to the city's hungry. But even such mundane matters were overshadowed by the looming specter of Tywin Lannister and the slow entangling of the realm's politics. Myrcella felt her throat tighten with dread more than once, yet she kept her smile calm. By the time Jon rose to go, she clung briefly to his hand before letting him slip away, wishing she could muster the words to explain how vital he had become to her sense of stability. She would find no easy sleep that night. Indeed, the next weeks provided little rest for anyone within King's Landing. War might not have crashed upon them anew, but conflict brewed in quieter ways. Rumors spread that Tywin Lannister was offering gold to any lord who would break with Myrcella. Allegedly, the sums were lavish, enough to fund an entire retinue for a year. Tywin had also begun courting certain Sellsword companies, some that had formerly been in the pay of the crown but now sniffed about for a bigger purse. Myrcella's spies whispered of clandestine meetings, of coin exchanging hands in the dark, of forged letters that might be used to turn the faith or certain houses against her. It was all so slippery, so endless. To complicate matters further, ravens arrived from Dorne. Prince Doran Martell acknowledged Myrcella's rule in a cautious, measured tone, yet he demanded justice for the murder of Elia Martell and her children decades ago, crimes largely attributed to Lannister hands. Myrcella's marriage to Jon had not changed the weight of those old grievances. The Martells had once sheltered Myrcella, in an alternate plan to wed her to Trystane Martell, but Joffrey's cruelty and Cersei's manipulations had ended that arrangement. Now, with Joffrey gone, Doran Martell seemed uncertain how to proceed. His letter proposed a formal treaty, recognizing Myrcella's claim if she would promise Dorne greater autonomy and a thorough investigation into the Lannisters' past crimes. It was another delicate thread in a tapestry of shifting loyalties. Meanwhile, ships from the Iron Islands were sighted off the western coasts, reaving villages for supplies. The Redwine fleet had once been the pride of the Reach, but the war had scattered ships, and the Tyrells had not yet fully committed themselves to defending Myrcella's rule. Word trickled in that Lord Tyrell was assessing the situation, waiting to see whether Myrcella's government in King's Landing would last before risking open conflict with the Ironborn. Every day, it seemed, new demands and crises landed on Myrcella's table. She barely had time to breathe, let alone reflect. Jon found his own tasks multiplying. As the consort, and a figure many lords associated with Northern honor, he was called upon to settle disputes, to give counsel at endless small councils, to inspect the city watch, to receive petitions from Northern merchants who wished to open trade under the newly signed peace with King Robb Stark. Now that the North was recognized as a separate kingdom, a handful of Northern traders had arrived with barrels of salted fish, hoping to see what bargains could be made. The city needed food, so Jon pressed for Myrcella's official support. But some Crownlands lords resented the idea of giving special privileges to Northern merchants. Jon quickly learned that even small steps of governance required delicate negotiation. He was spared some hours each day to train with a handful of knights in the practice yard, for war would never be far off. At times, Sansa Stark came to watch, leaning against a sun-warmed pillar as Jon sparred with Ser Courtenay or with a new recruit. She seemed lost in her own thoughts as well, adjusting to a life where she was no longer held hostage but remained a guest of the crown. The memory of Joffrey's cruelty lingered in her eyes. Yet she also found subtle ways to help Myrcella's court, giving friendly suggestions about which ladies might be trusted, which might be carrying tales to Cersei, how best to calm certain anxious courtiers. She was beginning to learn the subtle dance of kings landing from another angle, and her advice, tentative though it was, sometimes proved invaluable. One afternoon, after a sweaty round of swordplay, Jon found Sansa waiting, her gaze distant as she idly twisted a tuft of her auburn hair around her finger. He caught his breath, wiping sweat from his brow, and approached. "You seem troubled," he said gently, handing his practiced sword to a squire. Sansa glanced at him, blinking. "Oh, I'm all right. I was thinking of home." Her voice softened. "I received a raven from Robb. He says things remain calm in the north, for now, though winter creeps closer. He thanks me for staying here, representing House Stark's interests. But I'm not sure how helpful I really am." Jon gave her a sympathetic smile. "You've been helpful to Myrcella. To me, your observations about the court have been more accurate than some of the official counselors." She returned a small, sad smile. "It's frightening, isn't it? How easily I read the petty jealousies and secrets now. A few years ago, I would have been too naive to notice any of it. Father used to say that honesty was the best shield, but in this place..." She shook her head, letting the thought trail. Jon laid a hand on her arm. "I understand, but perhaps you can use what you've learned to protect others from suffering the same manipulations. You can counsel Myrcella, help guide her away from the worst snakes in the pit." Sansa nodded. "I will. I just hope we don't all get bitten anyway." Shortly afterward, they parted, Sansa heading inside to join Myrcella for a private meal, while Jon remained to speak with Ser Courtenay. The older knight, a stern man with a lined face, had a worn scroll in his hand. He offered it to Jon with a grim expression. "Word from Harrenhal," he said simply. Jon took the scroll, his stomach coiling in dread. He broke the red wax seal, a lion's head imprint, and scanned the lines. As he read, his throat tightened. Tywin Lannister had issued a call to arms to any true loyalist of the Iron Throne, claiming that Myrcella's government was illegal and that the capital was in the grip of traitors. He promised amnesty to any who abandoned Myrcella's cause now, before the final blow. The text dripped with confidence, as though Tywin believed a decisive stroke was imminent. "We're in for a storm," Jon muttered, folding the parchment. He must have something planned. Ser Courtenay nodded grimly. "We could fortify the city further, but that requires resources we barely have. Meanwhile, Tywin can move freely if the Riverlands lords remain unsure, if the Reach refuses to commit. We may need a preemptive strategy." Jon frowned. "Assault Harrenhal directly, you mean? Or disrupt his supply lines, possibly sow confusion in his allies. Turn the tide of public opinion further in Myrcella's favor." The knight sighed. "It's a tall order, Snow." Jon mulled over the words. "I'll bring it to Myrcella and the council. We must do something." He looked at the battered practice yard around them, imagining Lannister banners flying beyond the walls of King's Landing. He couldn't allow that. Not again. Within a day, the council convened in the Tower of the Hand, a place that still bore the ghosts of Ned Stark and Tyrion Lannister. Myrcella sat at the head of the table, posture erect, knuckles white where she clasped her hands. Lord Rowan, Maester Gorman, Septa Lyanna, representing the High Septon's voice, Sam Tarly, Ser Courtenay, and Jon Snow gathered around. Others hovered in the background, scribes and attendants. Myrcella read Tywin's letter aloud, voice shaking slightly on the edges. Silence reigned when she finished. Finally, Samwell Tarly cleared his throat. "He speaks as though he has an overwhelming advantage. Perhaps he does. If he's secured a loan from the Iron Bank and if lords are wavering, how do we stop him from marching?" Lord Rowan interjected, leaning forward. "Do we send an army to Harrenhal? We could march now, try to drive him back." Ser Courtenay grimaced. "We'd be marching with a smaller force, uncertain alliances. If we leave the city underprotected, the walls might be vulnerable should Tywin's allied forces slip around us. Harrenhal is a fortress near the Trident, difficult to assault. We might lose men we can't spare. Jon tapped a finger on the table. What if we send smaller detachments to intercept his couriers, disrupt his supply lines? If we can starve him or keep him from mustering his sellswords, he might lose momentum. We know Tywin relies on discipline. If that discipline is shaken, Lord Rowan pursed his lips. It might slow him, but we can't starve him out of Harrenhal entirely. Not easily. We'd need local support from Riverland's lords. Have we tried to bring the Tully remnants into the fold? Myrcella asked. Riverrun is allied with Robb Stark, but the old families in the Riverlands might prefer me to Tywin if I promise them security. We could send an envoy, Sam put in. Remind them that Tywin's men ravaged their lands before. They might be inclined to see him as the true threat. Myrcella hesitated. Then do so. Draft a letter on my behalf, Sam. Ensure they know we recognize Robb's claim in the north, but the Riverlands remain disputed territory. We promise them that if they remain loyal, we will protect them from Tywin's vengeance and restore their holdings once the conflict ends. Lord Rowan nodded, though he seemed cautious. It may sway a few, but Tywin's gold can be persuasive as well. Ser Courtenay cleared his throat. What of your mother? Tywin demands we release her. If we free Cersei. No, Myrcella snapped before he could finish. That would give Tywin a figurehead within the city to undermine me. She might do more harm than Tywin's entire army. A hush followed her heated outburst. Myrcella took a breath, steadying herself. Forgive me, but I cannot free her. At least, not yet. Jon sensed the raw wound behind those words. He knew Myrcella bore guilt, maybe shame, at holding her mother captive. Yet the threat Cersei posed was undeniable. Softly, he offered, perhaps we offer Tywin a chance to visit King's Landing under a peace banner to speak with Cersei. Some show of good faith that we're not mistreating her. Myrcella gave him a pained look. If I let him enter the city, he might attempt a coup, or even abduct her. Would that matter? He'd use her to rally the Westerlands. We must be careful. In the end, the council decided on two immediate steps: dispatching letters to Riverland's lords, urging them to rise against Tywin, and sending small squads of riders to harass any Lannister supply lines near the Crownlands and along the northern roads. It was a cautious plan, more defensive than offensive. Myrcella wanted no large-scale battles if she could avoid them. Too many had died already. The scribes took notes of every decree, and by the time the meeting ended, the sun hung low in the sky. Myrcella looked on the verge of collapse. Jon lingered as the others filed out. He approached her seat. Are you all right? He asked gently, noting her wan complexion. She managed a tight smile. I will be. I sometimes wonder if I'm missing something crucial. Tywin is cunning. He always plans 3 steps ahead. I feel like I'm only on the 2nd step. Jon touched her shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. You have good people around you. We'll watch each other's backs. She stood, leaning on the table for a moment. You should get some rest. You have to oversee the dispatch of those riders at dawn. Meanwhile, I'll pen some personal letters to the Riverlands lords. Add a queenly flourish. Maybe that will help. He nodded. Don't stay up all night. She gave him a wan look that said she would likely do just that. Sure enough, Myrcella burned the midnight oil scribbling letters by candlelight. The next dawn saw a flurry of activity in the courtyard. Riders gathering, armed with the Queen's orders and sealed pouches, setting off north and west. Jon oversaw the departure, ensuring each man knew where to go, which roads to watch, how to link up with possible Riverlands partisans. The endeavor felt woefully small. Against Tywin's gold and cunning, a handful of couriers and outriders might seem like a mere inconvenience. But if that inconvenience could buy time, time was a precious commodity, and fate saw fit to deliver a new challenge mere days later. Word arrived that the Ironborn, operating near the coast, had sacked a Crownlands port. The news caused an uproar in Myrcella's council. The Iron Islands were apparently testing the waters, seeing if the monarchy was too distracted by Tywin to protect its own shores. If the Ironborn continued seizing coastal villages, it could starve King's Landing of vital trade. Ships already avoided the city because of war and rumor. A blockade by the Ironborn might strangle them entirely. Lord Rowan, exasperated, declared in council, "We should have seen this coming. Balon Greyjoy or his reavers always strike in times of chaos. And with Tywin lurking, we can't muster a large enough fleet to chase them off." "We need the Reach's navy," Maester Gorman chimed in. "They have some ships left, or so the Citadel's records say. If the Tyrells fully commit, the Ironborn won't be able to raid so brazenly." "But the Tyrells are waiting to see which way the wind blows," Jon reminded them. "They haven't forgotten that we took the throne from Joffrey. They supported him for a time through Marjorie's engagement. They may be cautious about backing Myrcella unless they're sure she'll remain in power." A hush settled. All eyes went to Myrcella. She looked weary, but something in her expression shifted. Resolute. "We must secure the Tyrells' loyalty," she said. "If that means I need to arrange a betrothal or alliance, so be it." Her council shared uneasy looks. Marjorie Tyrell had once been slated to marry Joffrey, and that arrangement had ended in horror. But perhaps there were other Tyrell scions to wed to a prominent figure at court. Ser Courtenay pointed out that Loras Tyrell was a famed knight, though what alliance that might bring was unclear. Another possibility was forging trade agreements that heavily favored Highgarden, ensuring they profited from King's Landing's revival. The Tyrells loved gold and prestige as much as the Lannisters did, after all. Myrcella made her decision swiftly. "We'll invite Lady Olenna Tyrell or Lord Mace Tyrell to come to King's Landing under safe conduct. We'll propose a new alliance. If it means granting them certain privileges, so be it. We need their fleet to deal with the Ironborn, and we need their harvests for the city's sustenance." "What if Tywin has already reached out to them?" asked Ser Courtenay. "Then we must persuade them that standing with Tywin is more dangerous," Myrcella replied. "And that, if they help me hold the throne, I will never forget it." A flicker of steel shone in her green eyes. "Tell them I'm willing to hear their requests, no matter how extravagant." A courier sped off to Highgarden that very afternoon, carrying letters signed in Myrcella's elegant hand. The weeks that followed were a tense wait. Myrcella spent her days juggling the city's governance, ensuring the hungry were fed, balancing the pleas of merchants who demanded lower port fees, and courting smaller houses from the Crownlands to keep them from deserting. Rumors of Lannister bribes swirled, but so far, none of her vassals openly defected. Jon spearheaded efforts to coordinate small raids against Tywin's supply caravans in the Riverlands. Reports suggested modest success. Some Lannister shipments burned, a few outriders harassed, but whether it would slow Tywin remained to be seen. Sansa, for her part, quietly gathered what gossip she could from the ladies of the court, reporting to Myrcella if she heard any mention of secret correspondence with the Westerlands. Sam Tarly labored in the library, combing through records for any advantage. Old treaties that might bind certain houses, genealogical ties that could sway lords who prized ancestry. Ser Courtenay drilled the gold cloaks daily, honing them into a defensive force that might deter a second siege. All the while, Cersei Lannister remained a volatile presence within the keep. Myrcella had moved her mother to an ornate suite. No bars on the windows, but still guarded day and night. Cersei was permitted no visitors save a hand-picked septa and a rotating pair of maids, none of whom seemed fond of their charge. The Queen Mother raged and sulked in equal measure, sending Myrcella notes scrawled in furious handwriting, alternating between demands for release and venomous insults. Myrcella read them with tight lips, then burned them. Jon often saw the tremor in her hand after she consigned the parchment to ash. He knew that for all Cersei's crimes, it wounded Myrcella to be at odds with her mother. Yet she had no choice. A month passed in uneasy calm, and then one day, a flourish of trumpets announced the arrival of a Tyrell party at the city gates. Jon stood beside Myrcella on a balcony overlooking the courtyard as the delegation was escorted in. The Tyrell banners, green with the golden rose, rippled in the breeze, carried by a dozen well-armed knights. At their head rode Lady Olenna Tyrell in a wheelhouse, accompanied by her granddaughter Margaery. Lord Mace Tyrell was conspicuously absent. Perhaps that was a mercy, Jon thought, recalling Mace's self-importance. Olenna was the sharper mind, and Margaery was known for her charm. Myrcella took a deep breath, smoothing her gown. "Pray they come in peace," she murmured. They went down to meet their guests in the throne room. Olenna Tyrell, clad in her signature wimple and gown of pale green, assessed Myrcella with bright, piercing eyes. Margaery Tyrell, as lovely as ever in a rose-pink dress, curtsied low, gracefully offering Myrcella the courtesy due a queen. Olenna made a smaller bow, just enough to be polite, then flicked her gaze around the room. She noted Jon Snow's presence with a faint arch of her brow, as if intrigued. Myrcella offered words of welcome. "Lady Olenna, Lady Margaery, it is an honor to receive you in King's Landing. I trust the road was safe." Olenna sniffed. "Safe enough, though your highways could use better maintenance. Full of potholes and brigands, to say nothing of the stench in the villages. War is no friend to infrastructure." Myrcella managed a composed nod, ignoring the dig. "Please accept the hospitality of the Red Keep. We have prepared chambers for you both. We'd like to discuss an alliance that benefits House Tyrell and secures the realm." Margaery's voice was warm but measured. "We look forward to speaking, Your Grace. House Tyrell has always desired peace and prosperity for the Reach and all the realm. If we might help you achieve that, we're willing to listen." Olenna's gaze flicked to Jon, and she smirked. "And this must be your consort, Jon Snow, is it? I'd heard you were a man of the Night's Watch once." Jon inclined his head, recalling the boldness of the Queen of Thorns. "I was. Now I serve the realm in a different capacity." "Yes, well," Olenna waved a wrinkled hand. "I do hope your capacity includes ensuring we don't all starve come winter, or get stabbed in our beds by that dreadful Tywin." Myrcella suppressed a wince at the brazenness. "Shall we proceed to the Solar to talk in comfort?" she suggested, gesturing for her ladies to guide Olenna and Margaery away. They adjourned to a smaller chamber filled with sunlight. Wine and pastries were laid out. Olenna perched on a velvet chair, sniffing the pastries with an appraising eye, while Margaery arranged herself elegantly beside her grandmother. Myrcella and Jon sat across from them, with Lord Rowan and Ser Courtenay standing behind. A hush fell as Myrcella began. "You know the city's plight," she said gently. "We face potential assault from Tywin Lannister and a blockade from the Ironborn. We can no longer rely on the Lannister fleet or the Redwyne fleet. House Tyrell, however, still retains ships and enough men to defend the seas. If you would lend them to our cause, you would be saving King's Landing from another war. In exchange, we are willing to grant you favorable trade rights, a seat on my royal council, and—" she paused, meeting Olenna's sharp gaze. "Whatever else you might consider reasonable." Olenna sipped her wine. "Reasonable is a flexible word, my dear. House Tyrell has spent much time and gold supporting the crown in the past. Arranged matches, large armies, feasts. And where has that gotten us? We nearly lost it all under that vile boy Joffrey." She eyed Myrcella pointedly. "Cersei's brood has been a mixed bag." Myrcella held her composure. "Joffrey is gone, as you know. I can't erase what he did, but I can ensure that this realm does not revert to such cruelty. We aim for stability, so that no house need fear the tyranny of the throne." Margaery spoke up, her voice quiet but persuasive. "We have heard you are kinder than your brother. The small folk in the Crownlands speak well of you, despite the hardships. They say you have done what you can to ease their suffering. That is a mark in your favor, Your Grace." A faint smile curved Myrcella's lips. "Thank you. I would continue along that path, given the resources." Olenna set her cup down. "Yes, resources. That's where we come in, I suppose. We can provide ships to sweep away the Ironborn from the coast, but that is no small expense. Then there's the matter of supplying the capital with food. The harvest in the Reach is bountiful, though winter edges closer each day. If you want our surplus, you will need to make the bargain worthwhile." Her eyes glittered, cunning. "And beyond that, House Tyrell must be assured that should we commit fully to your cause, you will not treat us like an afterthought once you're secure on your throne. We have no appetite to be spurned again." Myrcella carefully folded her hands in her lap. "Name your terms." Olenna leaned back, letting Marjorie speak next. The younger woman's tone was melodic, carefully measured to sound earnest rather than grasping. "We would want significant representation on your council. A Tyrell hand or master of ships, perhaps both. We want formal recognition that the Reach is the second most prosperous region after the Crownlands, ensuring we have priority in trade agreements. We want an alliance that ensures if the Lannisters are defeated, House Tyrell benefits from any spoils or seized lands in the Westerlands. Lastly, my grandmother wonders if a royal betrothal might still be possible." Marjorie's gaze flicked meaningfully at Myrcella. "Now, we know you are already wed to Jon Snow, but perhaps others in your family or your circle could be matched to a suitable Tyrell scion. It never hurts to strengthen ties through marriage." Myrcella's brow furrowed at that last part. Tommen was still a boy, safe somewhere under guard with the retinue loyal to Myrcella. He was her younger brother, gentle, sweet, so unlike Joffrey. Was House Tyrell angling for a betrothal to Tommen? Or perhaps to someone else at court? Myrcella took a breath. "We can discuss which betrothals might be workable. Tommen is still young, but as you say, forging ties never hurts. As for seats on the council, I am open to awarding House Tyrell the role of Master of Ships, if your fleet is indeed at our disposal." Lord Rowan's eyes narrowed behind Myrcella, but he kept silent. He had served the Reach for much of his life before throwing in with Myrcella. Clearly, he bristled at the Tyrells claiming too much power. Olenna sniffed. "That's a start. Let's not forget that the Iron Throne still owes considerable debts. We'd prefer not to inherit that millstone around our necks. Are you still in hock to the Iron Bank?" Her gaze flicked to Jon, as if expecting him to have the answers. Jon spread his hands. "The Crown's debts are large, yes, but we are negotiating terms to restructure them. If we secure enough revenues from stable trade, we can pay them down. With your ships securing the shipping lanes, the city's tax revenues would rise again. Repayment would be feasible." The Queen of Thorns clicked her tongue. "Very well. Let us make an arrangement that ensures we won't be thrown to the wolves if the Iron Bank decides to collect in blood. House Tyrell demands a clear share of the port taxes from King's Landing for a period. 5 years, perhaps." Myrcella and Jon exchanged glances. It was a steep ask. Still, the city desperately needed a fleet to repel the Ironborn, and Tywin remained a looming threat. Myrcella nodded slowly. 3 years, she countered. "After that, we revisit the arrangement. But yes, you'll have a share of the port taxes." Olenna's grin was like a cat that had found a dish of cream. "Ah, good. Negotiation suits you, child. Perhaps you are more than Joffrey's sweet shadow." Myrcella fought not to bristle. "I have to be, for the sake of the realm." The discussion wore on for hours, delving into specifics of shipping rights, how many men House Tyrell would commit, where they would disembark if the Ironborn had seized ports. Olenna pressed for details about the Crown's stance toward Dorne. House Tyrell and House Martell had their own old grievances, after all. Myrcella tried to keep the negotiations moving, promising that if Dorne also offered its support, the Crown would treat them fairly and keep old feuds from reigniting. In the end, by the time candles burned low, they reached a tentative framework of alliance. It would still require formal signing and some measure of trust. Nonetheless, Lady Olenna finally retired to her prepared chambers with Marjorie, leaving Myrcella and Jon behind to lean back in their chairs, exhausted. "You handled that well," Jon said softly once the Tyrells were gone, relief lacing his voice. Myrcella nodded, eyes half-lidded. "She's formidable. I feel as though I've been dancing on hot coals." Ser Courtenay exhaled. "Better the Tyrells with us than against us. Their navy might turn the tide against the Ironborn." Lord Rowan still looked uneasy. "Just ensure you don't sign away half the realm to them. The Tyrells might come off as gracious, but they're known to be just as ambitious as the Lannisters." Myrcella forced a weary smile. "I'll be cautious." Then she rose, nearly stumbling with fatigue. Jon helped steady her, and they left the Solar to rest. The next weeks were consumed by hammering out the details of that alliance. Myrcella's scribes drafted treaties, which Lady Olenna corrected and recorrected, scrawling acid comments in the margins. Margaery played a more conciliatory role, meeting with Myrcella privately to reassure her that House Tyrell truly desired a stable realm. Myrcella found herself liking Margaery, or at least finding her pleasant enough company, though she remained wary, remembering how easily Margaery had adapted to Joffrey's court once upon a time. Amid these negotiations, an envoy from Dorne arrived, carrying Prince Doran's request for formal talks. Myrcella nearly laughed from exhaustion. Yet another region to appease, another set of demands. On the bright side, if she could somehow get the Martells and Tyrells to both support her, Tywin might be entirely outflanked. But bridging that ancient Martell-Tyrell rivalry would not be simple. Then one morning, just as the alliance with the Tyrells was poised to be signed in an official ceremony, the entire Red Keep was thrown into alarm. A messenger stumbled into the courtyard, half dead with exhaustion, and delivered a dire message. A portion of Tywin's forces had launched a surprise raid on a Crownlands town only a day's ride from King's Landing. By the time local militias roused themselves, the Lannisters had retreated, but not before burning storehouses and capturing local lordlings. It was a blatant provocation, a demonstration that King's Landing's outskirts were not as secure as Myrcella had hoped. Worse, the messenger reported that some villagers claimed the raiding party flew a dragon banner. Jon received the news in stunned disbelief. "A dragon banner?" he repeated. "Do they mean Targaryen?" "That's what the villagers said." The messenger insisted, pale as a ghost. "But it could be a trick or a ruse. The men who attacked had Lannister colors too." Ser Courtenay frowned. "Could Tywin be employing sellswords who use a dragon sigil to sow confusion? Or is there a Targaryen claimant in the mix?" A hush fell. Myrcella exchanged a glance with Jon. Rumors of a Targaryen across the Narrow Sea had persisted for years. Daenerys, the last known daughter of King Aerys, rumored to have dragons. But had she come to Westeros already? Or had Tywin conjured some pretender to rally anti-Lannister sentiment? Lady Olenna, present in the courtyard as the commotion broke out, sniffed. "What a load of nonsense. If a real Targaryen had landed on our shores, we'd have heard more than a single rumor from some peasants. Tywin must be playing games." Margaery, at her side, frowned. Yet the possibility can't be dismissed. Stranger things have happened in these wars. Myrcella's thoughts whirled. Regardless, Tywin's men are close to the city. We need to show we can repel them, or else the Tyrell alliance means little. She turned to her knights. "Rally a force. Ride out to secure the area and chase off any Lannister remnants. Show the Crownlands we're not helpless." Ser Courtenay nodded. "I'll lead them personally. With your leave." She glanced at Jon. "Go with him. We can't leave the city unguarded entirely, but we must send a strong enough party to deter another raid." Jon stiffened. "I'll gather men at once." In less than 2 hours, Jon Snow rode from the gates with a force of 50 armed knights and 100 mounted men-at-arms, Ser Courtenay by his side. Myrcella stood on the ramparts, Lady Olenna and Margaery behind her, watching the column snake across the muddy fields. The sight made Myrcella's heart clench. She knew how quickly battles could turn bloody, how easily a small confrontation could spiral into a larger war. She prayed Jon would return safely and victorious. The day passed in a haze of worry. Myrcella tried to focus on finalizing terms with Olenna and Margaery, but her mind wandered to the men in the field. By dusk, no word had come. That night, she could scarcely sleep. The next morning brought partial news. A rider galloped to the city gates, announcing that Jon and Ser Courtenay had engaged a Lannister raiding party near a burned village. The Lannister men fled after a brief skirmish. Supposedly, there had been no sign of a Targaryen banner, only the golden lion on crimson. The rumor of dragons might have been confusion or fear, but the men had inflicted some casualties before retreating. Jon's force held the ground, protecting the local peasants as they salvaged what they could. By midday, Jon himself returned at the head of the column, looking battle-worn and dusty but unharmed. Myrcella hurried to the courtyard as they filed in. She saw Jon dismount, rub his horse's neck, and speak softly to Ser Courtenay. Then he turned and caught sight of her. Their eyes locked. She stepped forward, ignoring protocol, ignoring the stares of knights and grooms. In that moment, she could only feel relief that he was alive. "How bad was it?" she asked, breath hitching. He exhaled, removing his gauntlets. "A raid, nothing more. 15 Lannisters on horseback, maybe a score of footmen. We think it was a probing maneuver. They burned supplies, took some prisoners. We drove them off, but they vanished into the woods." A flicker of frustration crossed his face. "They're testing us. Tywin wants us to know he can strike close to home." She swallowed. "And the dragon banner rumor?" Jon shook his head. "We found no evidence. Some frightened villagers claimed they saw a black banner with a red creature, but we found no such thing. Could be they mistook the Lannister lion in the dim light." Myrcella pressed a hand to her temple. "We'll keep an ear out for more rumors of Targaryens." He nodded, stepping closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "This is Tywin's game. He wants us unsettled, chasing shadows. We can't let him break our resolve." She offered a small, taut smile. "We won't." His gaze lingered a moment, warm, before he turned to oversee the men's disarmament and see to the wounded. Myrcella stood there in the courtyard, sunlight catching the golden threads in her gown, feeling a strange mix of relief, anger, and renewed determination. They were in a war of wits and steel with Tywin. He would keep poking, keep trying to undermine them. But if the Tyrell alliance was signed, if the crown could muster enough strength, they might outmaneuver the old lion yet. That evening, Lady Olenna sat down with Myrcella, Jon, and a scribe, signing the alliance documents with an exasperated sigh. She left blotches of ink on the parchment from her shaky but determined hand. "There," she said, "done. House Tyrell will dispatch a fleet to secure the coast from the Ironborn, and will lend you men if Tywin decides to launch a larger assault. In return, we get what we negotiated. Don't let it be said we aren't fair dealers." Myrcella placed her own signature and seal beside Olenna's. Jon affixed his name as consort, and Marjorie signed as a witness for House Tyrell. The scribe then dusted the parchment. It felt like a momentous step, one that might keep King's Landing from being starved or overrun. Afterward, the Tyrell party withdrew, with Olenna grumbling about tedious ceremonies, while Marjorie wore a small smile, as if quietly pleased with the day's outcome. Myrcella and Jon retreated to a private corner of the library. Candlelight flickered against the walls, illuminating rows of dusty tomes. Myrcella looked at him, a question in her eyes. "We have the Tyrells now, or at least I hope so," she said, voice soft. "Will it be enough?" Jon let out a slow breath. "It's a step. If they act swiftly against the Ironborn, that frees us from that threat. Then we can focus on Tywin." He studied her face for a moment. "You did well today. Securing that alliance took more than coin. It took them believing in you." She shrugged lightly, but her eyes glimmered with gratitude. "I hope they don't regret it." Jon bowed his head. "The real challenge might be whether we can coax Dorne to do the same, and whether we can neutralize Tywin's new sellswords before they mess." Her shoulders sagged. "One step at a time." He reached for her hand, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. She didn't pull away. They stood like that for a long, quiet moment, a slender column of candle smoke drifting between them. In the hush, Myrcella found herself leaning forward, resting her forehead gently against his chest. Jon's arms came up slowly, enveloping her. It was a brief moment of comfort, of unity, in a castle thick with tension and dread. Neither spoke, for the words felt insufficient. Their respite was short-lived. The next day, a raven arrived from Robb Stark, carried by a northern courier. Robb wrote that rumors of unrest were spreading like wildfire, that Tywin had possibly courted the Iron Bank of Bravos, and might soon field a larger army of sellswords than any lord had seen in recent memory. The letter ended with a stark warning. House Bolton had gone silent in the north, raising questions about whether they were secretly dealing with Tywin. Robb urged Myrcella to remain vigilant, for it seemed no corner of Westeros was free from the Old Lion's reach. The letter pressed a final point. If House Bolton was colluding with Tywin, the king in the north might have to divert forces to deal with them, which meant less support for the southern front if Myrcella needed help. In short, everyone was stretched to their limits. Myrcella gathered her council to share the news. Most took it grimly, but Sam Tarly looked especially pale when he heard mention of House Bolton. "They're known for cruelty," Sam murmured. "I dread to think how Tywin might use them." Jon found himself imagining Roose Bolton's cold gaze, the stories of flayed men. He'd heard rumors from the Watch. "We must not rely on the North for help," he said. "Robb has enough on his plate. We can't ask him to march south again." Lord Rowan frowned. "So we stand alone if Tywin attacks. Even with the Tyrell alliance, the margin is slim." Myrcella lifted her chin. "Then we must show a stronger face. The Tyrell fleet will take time to organize, but once they do, they'll secure the coast from the Ironborn. We'll gather the Crownland's lords for a muster. We'll call upon loyal Stormland's houses, Penrose, Estermont, the few that remain. We will show Tywin that if he tries a direct assault, he'll be met with steel and fury." "And if he starves us out instead?" asked Septa Lyanna. "The city stores are still not what they used to be." Myrcella grimaced. "Then we pray we have enough to outlast him. We must buy more time, and perhaps the Riverlands lords will rally. Or Dorne. Or perhaps we'll find another way to undermine Tywin's finances. We can't yield. Too many have bled for this throne to let it fall back into Lannister hands." A general murmur of agreement followed, though the mood in the council was somber. Night fell once more upon King's Landing, and though no battles raged outside the walls, the city pulsed with tension, the sense of an oncoming storm. That storm broke sooner than expected. Within a week, outriders rushed back reporting that a large Lannister host, perhaps 10,000 strong, had begun marching east from Harrenhal. They were skirting the Blackwater River, heading for the crossroads near Rosby. The rumor was they planned to cut off the main supply lines to King's Landing, effectively isolating the city from the north and east. A siege might not be far behind. The council erupted in alarm. 10,000 men was a formidable force, larger than Myrcella could muster in a single muster from the Crownlands. The Tyrell alliance was in place, but their main strength was at sea, and their ground troops had not yet arrived in full. Myrcella had to decide whether to march out and meet Tywin on open ground or remain behind the city's walls. Both choices carried lethal risks. Jon, Ser Courtenay, and Lord Rowan pressed the Queen to consider a partial field engagement. "If we let Tywin surround us," Lord Rowan said, "the city will starve. Better to strike before he can close the noose." Myrcella paced the council chamber, face taut. "But if we fail in the field, it would be a disaster. The city would be open to him. Perhaps we only need to slow him," Jon suggested. "A delaying action to give the Tyrell ground forces time to arrive. If we can keep him from forming a full siege, we might hold out." Maester Gorman added, "We could ask Dorne for a token force. If Dorne truly wants to see the Lannisters fall, they might send at least a cavalry detachment to harass Tywin's flank." In the end, Myrcella resolved to dispatch a smaller army, some 2,000 footmen and 500 cavalry, under Ser Courtenay's command with Jon Snow at his side. Their mission: harass Tywin's columns, hamper his ability to encircle the city, and wait for the Tyrell ground forces to reinforce. Meanwhile, the City Watch and the Queen's personal guard would remain behind to defend the walls. It was a plan fraught with peril. But with Tywin on the move, inaction would only ensure a slow death for King's Landing. On the eve of their departure, Jon found Myrcella in the Godswood, a small, scraggly plot of trees within the Red Keep's walls that offered a modicum of privacy. She stood by a weathered weirwood stump, her arms crossed over her chest, gazing at the faint reflection of moonlight in the still pool. He approached quietly. "You're going out to face Tywin again," she said softly, not turning. "I wish I could ride with you, but everyone insists the Queen must remain in the city. For morale, they say. Or for my own safety. Jon stepped closer. They aren't wrong. If something happens to you on the field. I know. She cut in, voice trembling. But I hate it. I hate sending men to risk their lives for me while I stay behind thick walls. She turned at last, eyes glimmering with unshed tears. Promise me you'll come back. He inhaled slowly. I'll do all I can, and I promise to avoid needless valor. Our goal is only to delay Tywin, not conquer him in open battle. She gave a shaky laugh. Needless valor. You really are Ned Stark's son. Bastard son, he corrected gently, though the sting of that label had faded somewhat. Myrcella had offered to legitimize him more than once, but he had wavered, unsure if he deserved it or desired it. You're still his son in spirit, she whispered, and you're my consort, the only partner in this madness I can truly trust. I can't lose you. He closed the gap between them, resting his hands on her shoulders. You won't. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers in a quiet gesture of reassurance. For a moment, they breathed in unison, hearts pounding. Then he kissed her, softly, the first time they had truly done so outside of a ceremonial or perfunctory moment. She froze, then melted into it, her hands curling into the fabric of his tunic. It felt like a moment stolen from a life they weren't sure they could have. A life without war, without intrigue, without watchers at every corner. When they broke apart, her cheeks were flushed in the moonlight. His voice was low. I'll be careful. Our cause depends on us both. She swallowed, stepping back to steady herself. Yes, she said, breath uneven. It does. They parted at dawn, the courtyard a bustle of activity. Horses stamped, men checked armor straps. The air tasted of anxiety and iron. Myrcella stood on the steps of the Red Keep, clad in a black cloak embroidered with gold. Her hair was bound in a tight braid. She nodded resolutely as Jon and Ser Courtenay led the troops out. The footfalls of thousands of men echoed off the stone walls. The gates yawned open, and the host passed into the bright light of morning. Myrcella watched until the last banner disappeared beyond the city's perimeter. Only then did she step back inside, feeling a hollow space in her chest. She hurried to the ramparts, scanning the horizon as the column of soldiers wound its way along the King's Road. She stood there long after the dust of their passage settled, biting her lip until she tasted blood. Then, drawing a ragged breath, she turned to attend to her duties. The Queen could show no weakness, no open fear, yet her heart felt as though it had been bound in iron. She told herself again and again that Jon had faced worse at the wall, that he would return. As for Jon, he rode at the head of the column, grim-faced but determined. Beside him, Ser Courtenay laid out their strategy. They would set up a defensive perimeter near a river crossing, dig small trenches and place sharpened stakes, lure Tywin's forward scouts into a skirmish, then withdraw if pressed. They did not intend a pitched battle. They only hoped to stall Tywin, force him to adjust his route, waste precious time. If the Tyrell reinforcements arrived soon, they might push Tywin to retreat. But if not, well, they would do what they must. For days, they marched under sun and occasional rain. Each night, Jon patrolled the camp, ensuring vigilance. Memories of the watch stirred in him. He recognized the same tension, men murmuring about the enemy out there in the dark. This time, the enemy was not an otherworldly foe but the unstoppable cunning of the old lion. And in some corner of his heart, he remembered the threat beyond the wall, the White Walkers. If the realm tore itself apart here, who would stand when the real darkness fell? Eventually, they reached a bend in the Blackwater River, near rolling hills that offered some vantage. They made camp, setting watchfires, sending scouts to watch the roads. Reports soon came that a Lannister vanguard was closing in, perhaps 1,000 men with more behind them. The plan commenced. Dig trench lines, conceal them with brush, prepare an ambush that might confuse and scatter the enemy's forward elements. By day, the men worked in tense silence. By night, they huddled around small fires, talking in whispers. Jon found himself perched on a rock by the river at dusk, gazing at the water's reflection. The gold and orange of the sunset stretched across ripples. He thought of Myrcella in the Red Keep, wondered if she was in the Godswood again, praying for a bloodless resolution. He almost smiled at the thought. How improbable it was that they had become bound together, each refusing to let the realm sink further. Perhaps Ned Stark would have approved, or perhaps he would have warned them that the Game of Thrones consumed even the best intentions. At midnight, the Lannister vanguard arrived. Torches speckled the distance, bobbing in the darkness as the enemy scouts approached. Jon and Ser Courtenay roused their men into position, hearts thumping. A horn sounded, a low note that thrummed across the hills. Then shouts erupted. Arrows flew, the night lit with sudden flashes as torches were dropped and men cried out. Jon led a detachment of cavalry around the flank, galloping across damp grass, swords drawn. They clashed with Lannister outriders, steel meeting steel in the moonlight. Chaos rang. As planned, once they inflicted enough disruption, they withdrew into the trenches, forcing the Lannisters to advance in confusion. More came forward, only to stumble into stakes, slip into dugouts. The riverland's echoes filled with the screams of wounded horses and men. Then, before the Lannister commander could regroup, Ser Courtenay signaled retreat. Jon's men melted back across the river, burning their temporary bridges. The Lannisters found themselves unable to pursue without reorganizing. A small victory buying precious time. For 2 more nights, they repeated variations of this dance. Ambushes, feints, quick withdrawals. Each time, the Lannisters suffered a handful of losses. Their progress slowed. Each time, Jon's men risked being caught, forced to scatter if the main Lannister force arrived. Morale was brittle, for they knew they could not hold forever. But the plan worked, at least for now. On the 4th morning, a dusty rider arrived in Jon's camp, bearing Tyrell banners. Word spread that a Tyrell host, led by a cousin of Mace Tyrell, had finally marched north from Storm's End. They were less than a day's ride away. Exhilaration rippled through Jon's ranks. They had done it, they had stalled Tywin long enough. The Lannister columns would soon face the combined forces of the Crownlands and the Reach. That evening, the Tyrell host arrived in a flourish of bright banners and well-fed horses. They numbered nearly 4,000, a respectable force, though not as large as the main Tyrell army rumored to be assembling further south. Still, it was enough to challenge Tywin if combined with Jon's men. The Tyrell commander, Lord Garland Tyrell, greeted Jon politely, referencing the alliance Myrcella had forged. Plans were swiftly laid. They would march to meet Tywin's main host before he could cross the Blackwater again, forcing him either to fight a pitched battle or withdraw to Harrenhal. Either outcome might spare King's Landing another siege. At dawn, the combined force set out, nearly 7,000 strong. Scouts reported that Tywin's army was only a few leagues away, possibly making a push east. The sun rose red, a smear across the horizon, an omen some took to mean blood would be spilled before day's end. Jon's stomach clenched at the sight, memories of the Watch's dire warnings surfacing. War was an old friend to Westeros, but it made him no less uneasy. Just before midday, they crested a low ridge and beheld the Lannister host spread out along a shallow valley. Crimson banners fluttered, a sea of spears glinting. Jon felt his heart pound. This was no mere raid or vanguard. This was Tywin's war machine. The old lion was there, somewhere in that mass, directing his men with practiced discipline. The Tyrell commander conferred with Ser Courtenay and Jon, deciding on a cautious approach. They would form a line along the ridge, forcing Tywin to either attack uphill or pull back. If Tywin tried to skirt them, they would harass his flank with cavalry. So they drew up in battle lines, Tyrell knights on the left, Crownland's men on the right, with the cavalry in reserve. Jon rode among the lines, steadying the men. He paused beside a unit of archers who trembled in their boots, reminding them that they had the high ground, that the Queen's name would guide them. He tried to project confidence he only half felt. Then he rode to the front, glancing down the slope at the Lannister formation. The midday sun beat down mercilessly. Horns blared from the Lannister side, echoing across the valley. Slowly, ranks began to move forward. A line of shields and spears advanced, red cloaks rippling behind them like blood. Jon inhaled sharply, adjusting his grip on Longclaw's hilt. This was the moment. They had come to the brink. Would the day end in victory or ruin? The Tyrell horns answered, and archers nocked arrows. A hail of shafts hissed through the sky, peppering the Lannister ranks. Shouts rose, but the shields caught many arrows. The line kept coming, disciplined as ever. Drums thundered, driving the pace. Jon's stomach knotted with tension. He signaled the Crownlands archers to loose another volley. Again, the black shafts rained down, and men screamed where they fell. Still the Lannisters advanced methodically. Jon glimpsed cavalry forming behind their lines, heavy horse, brazen in shining armor. Tywin meant to break their flank with a charge at some point. Ser Courtenay, astride a powerful courser, galloped along the Tyrell flank, urging the men to hold. Then, with a deafening roar, the front lines collided at the crest of the ridge, spears thrusting, swords ringing. The entire hillside erupted into chaos. Jon spurred his mount, leading a group of Crownlands knights to reinforce a wavering portion of the line. They crashed into Lannister spearmen, steel on steel, men shouting curses or prayers. Jon slashed with Longclaw, feeling the jarring impact as it bit into armor. Blood sprayed his hands. A Lannister soldier lunged at his horse's flank, but Jon pivoted, cutting the man down. Around him, men stumbled in the swirling melee, the stench of sweat, blood, and churned earth thick in the heat. Still they fought, the ridge turning into a desperate scrum. He glanced across the line, seeing the Tyrell banners wave. Garland Tyrell's knights crashed into the Lannister right, driving them back momentarily. But then a horn signaled from the rear of the Lannister host. Heavy cavalry charged up the slope, slamming into the Tyrell men-at-arms. The impetus was terrible. Horses and men screamed, the Tyrell line buckled, and a surge of red-cloaked riders tore through. Jon reeled, trying to keep his group coherent, but the swirl of violence was unstoppable at times. He heard Ser Courtenay's voice somewhere, bellowing for order. The sun climbed higher, scorching them all. Hours seemed to pass in a nightmarish blur of clashing steel and dust. Slowly, methodically, the defenders on the ridge wore the Lannisters down, arrow by arrow, cut by cut. The Lannister cavalry found itself mired among thick lines of Tyrell pikes. The Crownlands archers, placed on a flank, poured fire into them. Men burned or fled. Blood slicked the grass. Jon felt exhaustion creeping into his limbs, but adrenaline kept him upright, parrying blow after blow. At last, a mighty horn echoed from the Lannister rear, an unmistakable call to retreat. The line began to give, men stumbling backward, leaving behind the dead and dying. Tywin had realized he could not break the ridge, or perhaps he feared a greater encirclement. With discipline that spoke to the old lion's iron grip, the Lannister ranks began pulling back, leaving a field of carnage behind. The Tyrell horns cried triumph. The Crownlands men gave ragged cheers. Jon sat astride his horse, breathing hard, armor dented, his sword dripping with gore. All around him, men cheered or collapsed, triumphant but battered. The valley below seethed with retreating Lannister troops, some pausing to gather wounded. No sign of Tywin himself, but he must be out there, orchestrating their fallback. They had won the day at least. King's Landing, for now, would not be besieged. Ser Courtenay and Lord Garland Tyrell convened among the battered lines, deciding whether to pursue. Ultimately, caution prevailed. They would rest, tend to the wounded, and see if Tywin regrouped. But the victory was clear. The Crown's alliance with the Tyrells had staved off a second siege, proven that Myrcella's regime could fight. Jon found himself slumping in the saddle, numb with relief. He scanned the horizon, half expecting another wave of enemies, but none came. Instead, the Lannister host withdrew in orderly columns, no longer an immediate threat. For how long, he could not guess. The cost of the day was sobering. Hundreds dead or maimed. The hill, side slick with blood. As medics and maesters tended the wounded, Jon prayed that Myrcella's risk in forging the Tyrell alliance would not unravel in the face of such losses. War never ended cleanly, and Tywin was not beaten for good. Still, they had struck a blow, one that might force the Old Lion to reconsider a direct assault on King's Landing. That night, as the combined forces camped on the ridge, Jon sat near a low-burning fire, arms shaking with fatigue. He wrote a short message to Myrcella, describing the outcome, sending it by the swiftest rider to reassure her. He wished he could see her face when she read it. Relief, perhaps, or renewed resolve. Maybe she would even find a moment to smile. In the days that followed, the battered armies held their ground, watching the Lannisters from a cautious distance. Tywin withdrew west, toward Harrenhal or the westerly roads, leaving only small detachments to shadow the crown's movements. Jon suspected Tywin would not vanish entirely. He would regroup, reevaluate. But King's Landing was spared his direct threat for the moment, thanks to the Tyrell alliance and the men who had bled on that ridge. When word of the victory reached King's Landing, the city exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for too long. Celebrations were muted by mourning for the fallen, but a sense of hope flickered. Myrcella oversaw a solemn ceremony in the Red Keep's courtyard, honoring those who died defending her rule. She offered prayers for them, tears shining in her eyes. The small folk, hearing of the outcome, dared to believe that perhaps this young queen and her consort could indeed keep the Lannisters at bay. Yet in the midst of that fragile hope, new tidings arrived, this time from the sea. The Tyrell fleet had driven off some ironborn reavers, capturing a few longships. Under torture, the Ironborn admitted they had been approached by envoys claiming to represent a woman with dragons. Another swirl of confusion. Had Daenerys Targaryen truly crossed the Narrow Sea? Or was someone masquerading in her name? No one in King's Landing could say for certain. But it seemed the illusions of a Targaryen resurgence were not so easily dismissed. Thus, even after Jon returned to King's Landing in a battered, triumphant column, carrying the Lannister banners they had seized in battle, Myrcella could not rest. She embraced Jon upon his arrival, relief flooding her eyes, her arms clinging to him in the presence of the entire courtyard. But the next morning, she was again poring over letters in the council chamber, brow furrowed, trying to parse the puzzle of rumors about dragons, the Iron Bank, and Tywin's inevitable next move. The Game of Thrones continued. For that moment, though, as Jon placed the captured banners at her feet and knelt in homage, the city erupted in cheers. Myrcella looked down at him, her lips trembling with an odd mix of joy and sorrow. He rose, they clasped hands, and a wave of raw applause washed over them. The people saw in that gesture more than victory. They saw a glimmer of a stable realm, of a queen and her consort who might, against all odds, guide Westeros out of the darkest chapters of war. But behind those cheers, the deeper threats lurked. Tywin would regroup. Cersei seethed within the Red Keep. Dorne hesitated. The North was half a separate kingdom now, and the White Walkers loomed in the distant cold. Across the sea, talk of a Targaryen queen with dragons grew louder. The fragile tapestry Myrcella and Jon had woven could unravel with a single pull of fate's thread. Still, they stood side by side, battered but unbowed, proof that for at least one more day, the better path had not been extinguished. In the echoing throne room, Myrcella's voice rose above the din, thanking her knights, praising her people. Jon stood near her, Longclaw at his side, silent but resolute. They had chosen this course together, and together they would see it through, no matter how many storms awaited them on the horizon. If winter was coming, as the Stark said, then the realm would need every flicker of light to guide it. And so, hand in hand, they braced themselves for all that was yet to come, determined to hold the crown for the sake of a kingdom that had already bled too much.